So excited to introduce the first integral marketing support pod from ILiA. ILiA is back, and we're going to go directly over to Michael, who doesn't need any introduction. But if you want to read more about Michael, look in the show notes and you can read all about Michael.
Cool. Well, I'm happy to be in this conversation with all of you. You know, I'm not a marketer. I was never trained in marketing. And yet I've found myself over the years called upon to market my own services, but I think more importantly, supporting executives who, in pretty much any company that sells anything, has to have an understanding of marketing in some way, shape, or form. I've always been called upon, even though I don't have any expertise, to evaluate an organization's marketing because people want an outside perspective. And I've also been, like Charlie and probably others here, very overt about my understanding of integral. I don't often teach it to folks, but I use it and I tell people how I use it. And because of that, people have gotten profoundly curious. And what I've discovered is that, as time has kind of proceeded into the current age, I've found that more and more people are interested in taking a meta perspective, becoming more meta aware, and rise above some of the polarizing worldviews that exist in the world, particularly those who, Charlie and I get a chance to work with on a regular basis, right? We get to work with executives who are part of global enterprises. And what I've learned, it's really difficult to be a leader of a global enterprise and continue to be relatively parochial in your mindsets. You have to somehow transcend and include, the really good ones include. And one of the individuals that Charlie and I met when we were serving a facility up in northern Alberta was this executive who originally hailed from New Zealand, but a gentleman by the name of Mark. And it wasn't very long after meeting Mark that Charlie and I realized that this individual had a very elevated perspective. He really saw across a number of worldviews. And part of that ability is his ability to wade into any conversation and meet people where they are. And it was a remarkable ability. This organization that Charlie and I were serving moved very quickly from having a disconnected, disgruntled workforce, 1,500 or so, some odd people, to actually starting to rebuild a culture that they would eventually come to become proud of again. And they're currently in that state now where they've now seen what it feels like to be listened to in a profoundly deep way. And this gentleman, Mark's influence on this facility has been remarkable. This is a facility that was on the top of the list for transforming from an oil and gas company to an energy company, to move from relatively dirty oil sand-based products to relatively clean biofuel-based products, mostly farmed right there near the facility in the canola fields that grow forever in Alberta and Saskatchewan. You can see seas of yellow when you wander away from the plant, and you know what their feedstocks are currently. So Mark was an incredible influence. And what I observed, because I had a chance to work with Mark even after Charlie and I ended our major gig in the facility, but in subsequent conversations with him, as he started to lead other site GMs to be able to, again, begin to lead this energy transition that you hear so much about, or probably don't know about from an on-the-ground perspective. But what we recognize from Mark is his ability to simulcast, as Ken Wilber called it in Integral Spirituality, but he's written about it elsewhere, is the ability to be able to say inspirational things to a sea of people, and those people being operating at red, amber, right? orange, green, just to use spiral dynamics colors, the ability to connect with everybody in the audience through a 15-minute conversation, and then be able to engage in Q&A and handle any energy that was out there and be able to receive it, empathize with it, and bring back a targeted and beautifully crafted response. So when you see that in a leader, particularly a leader in the oil and gas industry, for God's sakes, you come away going, wow, how did that happen? How did this individual develop this level of skill? And what's nice, and we learned about that well after Charlie and I's major gig up there, he studied. He's engaged in deep practice, deep personal inquiry. By the way, Bet, for your benefit, he's a yoga instructor as well, in addition to many of the other credentials, right? So what is it about people who have that ability? What are the practices that they engage in? And one of the individuals that I worked with to begin to prepare Shell for some major work, and what Charlie didn't say about one of the oil and gas gigs, now I'm overtly talking about Shell. One of the things that Charlie didn't say about the current work that he and I are doing over there is that what's on the table in a leadership development program, perhaps for the first time ever on a mass scale, is mindset, belief, right? The internal structures and even internal practices of visualization, mindfulness. And we don't call it those things because we understand that we have to simulcast to a varied audience. So we're very selective in the words that we use, but we bring practices to this group to impact deep internal change. And here's probably the best finding of all in this work is it's working. Beliefs are being transformed. They are growing leaders from the inside out to be able to guide this energy transition. More marks are being created within the context of this super major energy company. Or to say it like a colleague of mine, Teresa Waddington, who works for Shell and is the head of DE&I and a variety of things, that Shell is transforming her father, who worked in the oil and gas industry, transforming the oil patch into tomorrow's energy garden. And that fundamental shift of perspective is beginning to land in the thousands in a super major oil and gas company. To me, that's remarkable. And when I think about these elements that are being done in a context that is inherently resistant to change, like Shell, what I recognize is the work that was done by a colleague of ours ages ago. And it actually inspired me to go back and revisit this work. And it was done by our good friend Barrett Chapman Brown, Barrett C. Brown. When he wrote a number of things about sustainability, he took the things that he was studying around sustainability and sustainability communication, took that over to the Dutch Sustainable Trade Initiative, and began to do supply chain works, sustainable supply chain work in that context, using those same ideas that he explored about a half a decade prior to that, successfully. So it was one of those things where we recognize that the ability to communicate to multiple value systems simultaneously is a skill that can be cultivated. It can be cultivated in an individual. It can be cultivated in large-scale organizations and every level of system in between. And so it was this revisit of Barrett's work on sustainability communication using the interval model that I thought would be really instructive for us to take a look at and say to ourselves, what value does this provide? How does this spur our thinking about how we communicate, how we influence, how we pitch ideas, how we put forth policy. There's so many applications to this that are in this whole realm of influencing fundamental mindsets of people who we target to begin to transform in regard to those mindsets. So let me share a couple of things. Some of you may even remember some of this work, but I'm going to share a couple of things with you as a reminder. But please, recognize that I want this to be a conversation. So I want to show these things, then I want to come back and talk about these things as we go. So this is just a revisit of, standard 4 quadrants. And what I love about this representation in one of Barrett's articles about effective influence around sustainability is that we can use 4 quadrants as a recognition that we are always simultaneously influencing different aspects of reality. And when I talk about the 4 quadrants to my clients, I talk about the 4 quadrants as a map of reality, as an orienting device. I remind them of things like, the map is not the territory, it's a crude representation, it's a big picture, it's a thumbnail sketch, it's not the details, but it allows us to orient to different aspects of reality. So when I look at something like this, and I'm hearkening back to when I had a conversation with my son Cameron around policy, one of the questions I asked Cameron right away is, what is this policy's intention? What is this policy trying to influence around society or around behavior? And it would get him to explore the possibilities. And so I used the map as one way to start the conversation about what's the intention of an influence, of a policy, of a intention to shift a mindset. Are you simply trying to change a belief system? Are you trying to influence behavior in a particular way? Are you trying to rebuild a system so that the system can accommodate more or different? Or are you trying to create a culture shift, an openness to receiving a different set of shared values, a different aspiration? So I'm going to ask all of you to reflect on this for a moment. When you think about a situation that calls upon you to influence or market or begin to move a perspective from one place to the other, where do you often go? This is a question that Barrett used to ask me all the time. From where should we be orienting in order to influence what we intend to influence? And of course, we as integralists know that it doesn't matter where you start sometimes, they're all interconnected. So ultimately, you're probably going to be at one point in time touching on all 4 quadrants in order to drive an effective influence strategy. So I'm going to just pause the share for a second and kind of just drop us into the inquiry about this. What does the simple 4 quadrants do for us in regard to influence, in regard to marketing? Again, craft it as you wish.
Well, I would say, Michael, the way that I teach them now, and I use them as a guide to making something fully real. Okay. And if something is fully real, it will have psychological component, it will have a cultural component, behavioral component, and a systems component. And so I'll use it as a beginning tool to see where are we biased, and what are we leaving out? And what can we bring in to make this more full and more real?
And Ross, by making something more real for another, what are you intending to do for them?
I'll respond to that, and it depends, of course, upon their context. In a coaching context, and I do coach lawyers, first of all, it's what they're intending. So they're going to set the agenda to a very large degree, but it always is a sense that they want to grow. Okay. And I find them in a fairly contracted state in a role with a certain way of thinking that is prescribed described in the role. And so I help them, or if they want to be helped in that way, to move out into a bigger one. Give you one example. They when I first started doing integral coaching with lawyers, guess who showed up? It was mostly women in the 8 to 10 year mark that had been getting A papers all their lives. They'd been working for their college professors, their law professors, their bar examiners, their partners, and they hit a male-dominated oligarchy called a partnership. And suddenly, everything that they have is a lesser included skill, and it really doesn't matter that much anymore. And they are going to have to develop a whole new way of looking at the world in order to move up to the next level and not just sit there and push paper all their lives, which they don't want to do. So I find that it's that it's useful in that context to say, okay, let's take a look at these 4 things. What could we change, in your individual interiors? What could we change in the communication, the way that you're communicating? What could we change in behaviors, and also in the systems that are there? So yeah. So I had a gal, the most successful one we had last year. She was able to come up with an identity in the cultural milieu of her firm, which was to become the best loved person in the firm. Okay. That was going to be her advancement strategy that we worked out. It worked really well for her. It was her natural way of being.
So
that
having to sell her soul in the process.
Yeah. So I'll stop there. Did that answer your question? It seemed like a long-winded answer.
No, it was a great answer, Ross. In fact, the fact that you pointed to a personal aspiration and helped her map her cultural influence strategy in many respects is brilliant. It's a brilliant move, which I'm sure included, fine-tuned behavioral adjustments and then boundary setting at the same time, because if you want to be the best loved person in a firm, you're going to probably put out there some possibilities that others will, push your boundaries. So how do you set boundaries and be the best loved lawyer in the firm?
No, exactly right. And also bringing forth psychological dimensions. She had a tremendous psychological depth and had what she called her wing gal, which is a unused subpersonality. That was interesting, juicy, sexy, that needed to walk into a room in a different sort of a way and use that within, established boundaries to get some freedom within a framework for that part of herself to come forward when she was meeting people, which she hated to do previously, but once that wing gal got in charge, it got a lot more fun for her to walk through a room and be an influencer in it.
Right, because she's putting it in a larger context.
Right.
Oh, wow. That is really a great example, Ross. Tremendous. Anybody else have questions for Ross around this? It's a challenge, right? To, particularly for women in male-dominated entities like law firms. Wow, it's a huge challenge in that context, right? And it requires a certain degree of savviness about the context, but savviness about self and how you can bring an integrated sense of self to an aspiration to conquer that system. By the way, it's not any different in the oil and gas industry and some of the women that Charlie and I have coached, where they absolutely find aspects of themselves, bring it together, and then drive it behind a aspiration to make a difference. And many capable women have been successful doing that in male-dominated industries. Just remarkable. Cool. Any other thoughts related to Ross's example? Or anybody else want to share another example for themselves?
I find this extremely interesting. I've seen this quadrant thing hundreds of times, right? But I'm thinking about very specifically for my customers that I'm working with on this small startup that I have. And I'm realizing that even just helping them realize how they approach each of these quadrants with the problem my software solves will uncover so many things, just like Ross was saying, we are operating in a way just basically with blinders on, unaware. And also sometimes when we become aware, we go like, oh, that's bad. I shouldn't be trying to be loved, right? And we just like label it instead of saying like there are pros and cons of this and there's ways to do it well. And let's embrace the things that really, but watch out for these warning signs. I just think like I have so much stuff going on right now and we could just stop for here. It's like amazing. But yeah, this is really good. So I'm going to basically go through these four quadrants and really dig in and maybe even use it when I have conversations with my customers to say, like, what are these assumptions, right? These assumptions that you're not really surfacing and being aware of. So yeah, that's what's coming up for me right now.
But
Yeah.
there's something beautiful that showed up for me as you were talking in that, which is I've been focusing a lot over the last, well, it turns out for the last 30 years, but I only realized it in the last 2 or 3. I focus a lot on choicefulness. And in my martial arts practice, in my Zen practice, in my consulting practice, all of those places. And one of the ways that shows up, and the quadrant map can be super useful at highlighting these things, is when we have something that comes up like, oh, no, I shouldn't try to be loved.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that is doing is walling off an area and saying, I can't choose this, or I can't choose that. And we do that here and there and here and there and here and there and end up with this tiny little field of operation that is the only thing left to us. And it's because of how my dad was and because of what I experienced when I was 6 and all of those things narrow and narrow and narrow that field. And one of the things that this approach and our approaches in general can do is say, well, wait, hang on. What about this? What about that? What about this? To expand it again, to allow us really, if I don't do that, it's not because I can't. It's because I chose not to. If I don't do this, it's not because I shouldn't. It's because I chose not to. And that creates a field of options that is so much bigger than what we ever thought it could be by doing that exercise. And I think the quadrant map really supports that.
Very cool.
Yeah. Thank you.
In the interest of time, I want to share another another simple 4-quadrant map, but it's oriented a bit differently. And again, in the spirit of practices, I want to invite you into a practice of looking at the quadrant map and then looking at the world of advertisement, marketing, and saying to yourself, what have I seen in the world of advertising and marketing is speaking to that quadrant more exclusively than another quadrant? And I think it's a really fun little practice. Again, it's one of the practices I've done with my son Cameron recently that you might have some fun with. And this representation comes from another one of Barrett's articles. And if you notice the way that the way the text is written here, it's defining the upper left as what I experience, and the upper right, of course, is what I do, and then the lower right is what we do, and then the lower left is what we experience. Now, you can read the other elements of this diagram as well, but begin to percolate on when you see an advertisement, on television, or an ad in a magazine, or even a political pitch, right? It could be anything, anything. What examples do you have of a particular advertisement or article or example that is oriented primarily from a particular quadrant? And I'll start us off. I'll give you an example of one that always occurs for me, and I laugh about it all the time because I think they're the silliest commercials ever. And they're the perfume ads, the cologne ads, right? And those, they're silly. They have very few words in them. They're generally dealing with very vivid and provocative images. Where do you think that those are coming from?
Can you zoom in a little bit, Michael?
I can. Yeah, let me see if I can do that real quick. Is that a little clearer? I don't know if it changed your experience at all. And I'll tell you my answer to that question, but I hold that as primarily an upper left oriented ad. They're speaking directly to the person, right? They're really kind of driving on the interior. They're trying to give you an experience. It's usually an appeal to ego. There's usually some serious, sex appeal or wealth that it's trying to kind of tap into, those values and beliefs, underneath materialism oftentimes, but beauty. So that's one that just stood out to me. These perfume ads that are very much, oriented to the upper left. Wondered if anybody had any perspective on that, examples of that. The ones that Victoria and I laugh about are the ones with Johnny Depp, right?
I agree. And it's also similar to beer commercials where it's a lifestyle. It's selling a lifestyle, and it's saying you can belong to this group. It's that feeling, that sense of belonging. You can belong to this, and then you feel good about yourself, often, as you said, egotistically, and then you pay money for that thing to belong, when that thing actually has nothing really logically to do with what you're buying into.
Yeah, for sure.
So Heather, that reminds me of our companies very clear about being inclusive versus exclusive. If you don't feel like you belong, we don't care. We want the people that feel like they belong. And if you don't belong, then belong somewhere else. That's kind of interesting too, right? Am I trying to convince everyone to belong to this community, this vibe, this lifestyle? Probably not.
Right.
It reminds me of the think different, right?
Mhm.
We think if you buy this, you think different, just like us.
Right. The Apple ads back in the 80s.
Yeah. I think there's an interesting contrast or decision was made that contrasts both ways here in terms of pharmaceutical ads. And I remember back when pharmaceutical companies first were allowed to advertise, because that was not always allowed for prescription meds, and it was often very technical, and it was sort of a lot of upper right stuff, and then things have shifted, and I was free of ads for a long time when I cut the cord and stopped watching broadcast TV, but now some of the streaming services are only offering certain things ad supported, and I've seen way too many ads for various pharmaceuticals recently, rewatching some old shows, and they are so firmly turned towards the upper left.
Mm-hmm.
About capturing that feeling of freedom from Crohn's disease, or whatever it might be. And there's roller coasters, and there's parties, and there's dinner parties and there's all this stuff going on. And then this subtext of the very technical stuff, because they were legally required to say it. And so it's like this weird tension between upper left and upper right that I think they don't very skillfully resolve, frankly. But I think that's another piece of how this is how the mapping here can be useful for understanding some of the marketing messages we see or the things we try to do.
Nice, nice. You know, oftentimes when we see ads for software, it's oftentimes an appeal to the upper right, how you can do better, faster, more thoroughly, how you can get things done in a shorter time, etc. Like I see a lot of ads that are pointed in that direction. And then the other domain of the upper right are fitness ads, right? That have a little bit of upper left appeal, but they really, you know, kind of, you're the kind of person who can do this and be this, is a big thing they're trying to activate in those cases. And by the way, that's oftentimes how I think about influence, is what's trying to be activated. What aspect of a person or a system is trying to be activated by the influence strategy. Anybody see things that occur in ads that are appealing to collective experience?
I see ads for that sort of focus on team sports, that whether it's kids sports and things that make that car ads sometimes do this, the ads for a minivan, but the way they make it desirable is by you going to the softball game and doing and piling everybody in and going for pizza, and there's all this collective stuff that becomes possible. I guess it's both lower right and lower left, but this collective stuff that this minivan allows.
Yeah. Yeah, another example that occurs for me too, Charles, and kind of the same kind of feel are theme park ads, right? So, you know, the Disney experience, the Universal, you know, Studios experience, but also restaurant ads. Restaurants stopped appealing to individual appeal, and they always made it about the gathering around the table, right? And the joy, particularly, that could be bringing you right now if you only came to Red Lobster or Outback or whatever it might be.
Yeah. I just saw Victoria's text chat. I think that's exactly right. The 70s Coca-Cola ad.
Right, right. I could teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. Yeah.
But I think I would say that the question, does that hit all four quadrants, is yes. I mean, I suppose on one sense they all hit all four quadrants, just depends on how skillfully. But I think one of the reasons that was so powerful was that it was lower left, the world, all of us together, and a lot of imagery of groups, and then but also the individual feeling of, I would like to teach the world to sing, and wouldn't that be joyous to be that person who does that? And yeah, I think there's a lot of richness in that as an example. I wouldn't be surprised if we went through, a list of the 20 most influential commercials in history. I would be willing to bet that all of them do a great job of hitting all four quadrants.
Yeah. Yeah. And I imagine they probably do a pretty good job in appealing to multiple value systems as well.
At least the ones from the last 50 years.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. Well, I want to stop sharing this for a moment. I'm going to switch over to another diagram because I think we're starting to turn into this territory. And I think it would be helpful to see some things that, again, our friend Barrett created for us a long time ago that I think are helpful here. And then as soon as we are done with this, we'll move into a conversation about ChatGPT and what it can do for us in this regard. So let me just show you this for a second. This is going to be hard to read, but it's really important not to necessarily read it. But this came out in Cosmos magazine back in 2005. It was an article written by our friend Barrett Brown, and what he did was a really remarkable thing. You know, he was really diving deep with the Integral Institute at the time. You remember this time, Ross, and creating a bunch of really practical works. And he did some refashioning of the levels, and again, is applied to sustainability. And he created a number of value mean categories that really kind of took off in some domains. When I had first heard about this particular work, not from Barrett, but I heard about it from a person who was doing sustainability work in the UN. And then I went back to Barrett and I said, "Hey, no idea you wrote this," but it did influence a lot of people. And these labels, again, I think are really skillfully chosen by him, where it takes and looks at sustainability from the intended audience that's perceived, but also in the individual who's holding that intent to influence. So you can see some of these elements: the eco guardian, the eco warrior, right? The eco manager, the eco strategist, the eco radical, and he mixed them up, right? So they don't just go in typical spiral dynamics or Ken Wilber's orders necessarily, but you can see green in the eco radical. You can see a little bit of yellow in the eco strategist. You can see orange in the eco manager. You can see red in the eco warrior, and you can see amber in the eco guardian, right? Which I think is really interesting. And then, again, by the way, Bet and I are going to send these to you at the end, so you have this little collection of articles, because I think they're really helpful and useful. And one of the things I wanted to show you is these images that Barrett found to represent each one of these categories. And this is where his work, after kind of discovering it through the UN, we started to incorporate it in our UN programs, because it was just a very succinct piece about appealing to and checking in with yourself about where your intentions are coming from. What values are you holding in your attempt to influence? And that was a really important piece as we began to send people out into the world to influence in the context of this UN work we were doing. We really wanted them to have a degree of self-awareness about how they were striving to influence, because it really mattered depending on the community they were supporting. So anyways, I wanted to show you this real quick. But more importantly, I think it's probably this last thing I wanted to share with you that's even more important. So let me just switch that screen and go to this. Just so you know that this particular system has this capability. So again, I'm going to share screen. And what this will do is bring up just a ChatGPT screen. So what I'm going to do here is, for those of you who don't have the direct link to the chat function of ChatGPT, because sometimes it gets buried in communications around ChatGPT, but if you go to this particular link, that'll give you the chat version of GPT. There's a variety of different ways of plugging into GPT. I find the chat version more functional than anything else, around GPT-3. And this is GPT-3. Charlie and I have been in discussions about GPT-4, which has some broader capability. But if you just want to play around, this version 3 is the place to play, because it's going to be much more responsive. GPT-4 is going to take a while and chews on your commands a little bit longer. But what I wanted to show you is, this was a little experiment. It was an experiment that I did for that marketing client I was telling you about earlier. as a way of helping her understand the applications of spiral dynamics. And again, with ChatGPT, you ask it questions, you give it commands, you can pretty much speak in regular language to GPT. And when you do, recognize that it's scanning the entirety of the web to be able to find an answer to your questions. And it's not offering up opinion, it's offering up what it's pulling. And recognize that there's a lot of crap out there on the web. And so it can be bringing you a bunch of crap, right? It's not necessarily always providing you the right answer, right? So keep that in mind. But what I find, and a lot of people who are playing with GPT are finding, is it's really helpful in solving our blank page problems. The way if you're sitting there with a blank page, you have no idea how to actually begin an inquiry of yourself. You don't necessarily know exactly what to write, what kind of marketing pitch to create, etc. ChatGPT is good for that purpose. ChatGPT will be GPT-4 will allow you to kind of get really deep responses from any of your queries. But GPT-3 will give you a pretty much top line. And for most purposes, for people who are creating blogs or creating marketing copy, this is perfectly adequate. GPT-3 is perfectly adequate to start into the conversation. In fact, GPT-4 is a little bit too tempting to let it do all the work for you. But GPT-3 isn't tempting because, again, you have to scrutinize everything because not everything makes sense in reality. Anyways, so, this is one of the things that I did with this particular client is I asked them, again, they're a consumer products company. And given that this individual already had an understanding of spiral dynamics, I just used spiral dynamics as a way of being in this conversation. And by the way, for ChatGPT, it'll look at spiral dynamics, but every once in a while, it'll throw some other developmental models and labels in there. So it doesn't really care what developmental model. You're just kind of pointing it in a direction. Every once in a while, I get results back that sound a little bit more like Bill Torbert than they do Don Beck, right? And again, it's just kind of looking at that general territory that it considers developmental models or value memes. So this is the response back here that you see from the inquiry of give me an example of a marketing pitch for shampoo to a spiral dynamics amber audience. And if you look down at there, it'll give you a little paragraph, kind of like it's called an orienting paragraph. And then it's giving you the marketing pitch specifically in quotes there below the orienting paragraph. And so I'll just give you a chance to read that. And you just ask yourself, what about this really kind of lines up with amber or conformist worldview?
I love how it's time tested, tried and true solution, timeless values, guided us for generations. And yet, this is a new shampoo.
Exactly.
Michael, just to highlight one piece, you talked about it draws from the whole internet and it isn't locking in.
Not
anything. One example of that is spiral dynamics does not mention amber.
Yeah, exactly.
Spiral dynamics calls that blue, and yet somehow the ChatGPT figured out that that's what you meant by amber.
That's exactly right. That's why I tell you, it's kind of pulling from a general pool. It doesn't really care specifically.
Yeah, love that.
And then if we go down, just looking at the orange example, I love the first line, elevate your hair game.
Yes, that's what I've done.
Who here needs to elevate their hair game? Certainly Charlie does. And again, in the way that I used it with this particular client, the way I used it with my son, Cameron, same kind of way. As I said, you don't want to grab this stuff and put it out there as gospel, obviously. But there's some really key things that you want to look at within here that gives you suggestion and ideas. And it's suggestion and ideas about how to evaluate something that exists, but suggestion and ideas about how to use language in a skillful way to, again, appeal to a particular value scheme. What I haven't seen done well yet within the context of GPT-3, but it's a little bit better in GPT-4, is when you ask it to simulcast. When you say, give me an example of a marketing pitch for shampoo that appeals to spiral dynamics, blue, orange, and green. And what it does is gives you a paragraph of each rather than an integrated whole that integrates across all three, right? And what I've, again, even in that situation where the intent is to simulcast, it's easy for an editor to kind of get those things together and create a succinct example that's an integration of all three, for example. And so that's been kind of cool in working with this CMO client of mine, is that we've been able to play with it enough where they can see what a simulcast message would look like that's different from one that's appealing just to a targeted meme, like, what we've been seeing here. And then for the green one is very similar to what you may have seen on the documents that Barrett wrote. But again, pretty obvious in many cases. So I'm going to stop share there, and I want to move us just into a conversation about this. And we can kind of go into all sorts of conversation about ChatGPT and ChatGPT-4 just in itself, because what I've discovered in playing with it as I have, I've learned so many wonderful things. I've learned to accelerate a lot of my processes that were formerly felt like I was slogging through mud. I've been able to accelerate a lot of some primary activities that involve writing, but not just writing, but making sense of things that are happening in the world and trying to tie them together with various core ideas. I've written somewhere around 30 different blogs within just a month period. I use my March as a concentrated, like my end of February, March, as a period of time where I was just going to do some focused writing. And in that period, I was able to generate 30 some odd blogs, 50% of them oriented to my Metatropia brand, the other 50% oriented to my Exalt brand, which is about to be launched after the completion of a promotional video. And then the first, I'm nearly done writing a book on responsive intelligence. And what I've been able to do is run chapters through ChatGPT 3. I've done a couple of works with ChatGPT 4, but with ChatGPT, just to ensure that I'm stylistically consistent across all the writing, because I wrote so much of that over this huge span of a year and a half that I was worried that I was adopting one style and I was learning a lot, then I was throwing in a different style. So I created kind of I used ChatGPT-3 as a way of creating consistency across all my chapters. And I was doing that at a time where ChatGPT-3 came out with a little version where it could learn your style. I already have blogs out there, so it had stuff defined on me, but I also allowed it to look at stuff that I had done in the system and saved it. Unfortunately, that particular function within ChatGPT doesn't work any longer. It was out there on the beta release, but one of the things you can do, and I'll give you an example of that right away if you're interested. Are you interested? I want to share with you about stylistic writing. So let's just use this little thing as an example, and I'll cut it and I'll paste it back in the chat window. And then what I'll do is I'll say, rewrite the following in the style of, and somebody give me a famous author, anyone. Any famous author?
Twain.
Who's that?
Mark Twain.
Mark Twain. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm asking ChatGPT 3 to rewrite that marketing blog, that marketing paragraph in the style of Mark Twain, and see. Oh, and it didn't do that. Sorry, I might have to reload. Sometimes this happens with GPT 3. Let me do this real quick. Restart it, and then I'll paste that back in there. Delete the crap. And then ask it to do it again. And there it goes.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you know, in my world, sometimes when I'm trying to sound a little bit more sciencey, and because I've done some ghostwriting for Daniel Goleman, I'll sometimes ask it to rewrite something in the style of Daniel Goleman, and it'll start throwing in a bunch of technical and scientific details in the way that Daniel Goleman writes. Sometimes I want a piece to be very, very succinct and very, very newsy sounding. So I'll say, please rewrite this in the style of the New York Times. Other times I'll want to replicate the styles of my favorite authors like Malcolm Gladwell or Daniel Pink or Riane Eisler. I really started getting into writing something. I wrote a few things for the sex positive community. And so I use Riane Eisler and then Esther Perel as core authors. And that was a lot of fun to kind of see, you know, things that I wrote get reworked into a style of a very different author who's used to writing to the sex positive community, for example. And that's a really interesting experiment. But I love when you can do things like this because it allows you to compare and contrast different styles and to decide for yourself, like, what style do I really want to move to capture in the things that I want to write about? So the subject can be yours, and then you can just play with it stylistically to see what comes up. Or you can say things like, you know, this is one of my favorites, and Victoria will laugh at me because she knows who I am. And rather than staying a style of a person, I will go something like in a snarky and sarcastic style.
And you couldn't just say in Michael McElhinney's style there?
You would have picked that up, absolutely. Yeah, it's just like it's been a fun toy to play with. But again, it can create so much productivity out of you because you're able to generate so much content. You can take a core. So what I do is I keep all my documents in Google Docs, and I keep 4 or 5 different versions of it. And then I'll go into this ChatGPT and I'll work with various styles, and I'll pull different sentences and that I really, really like because they just convey something real powerfully in a way that I hadn't come up with yet. And then you're never going to take what ChatGPT writes for you and you're never going to use it in its original form. You got to edit the heck out of these things. But for me, for example, if I'm doing a 2-page blog, it does. You know, I've actually calculated this. It's cut the time of writing a 2-page blog from somewhere around 11 hours to about 2 hours. That's a huge reduction. But I'm still putting some significant energy into it, but it's not the blank page energy that I would have typically put into it. It's more of the editing energy. And what I know about myself, I love to edit. I hate blank page stuff. I hate the initial stages of just brainstorm writing. So for me, it totally fits my style, where I can get something out and then allow myself to be in this joyful place of editing. So anyways, I wanted to share with you that and connect it to what we were just talking about in terms of using AQAL as a way of, you know, kind of tuning our message. By the way, one of the things I've been writing is to youth sports organizations. And I find it difficult just on my own to write in pretty much purely orange and green language. I really struggle with that. I start to deviate, and it causes me a lot of problems because I'll create something and I'll get a little bit wedded to it, but I'm missing the mark. I'm missing my target audience. So most of what I write for Exalt is primarily to, again, a orange and green audience. And so I find that I go to ChatGPT first to get some of the basic language, and then I put my own style and content in there from that place. Again, it just makes it much more efficient for me. So I'm not writing way up here, right? Or I'm not kind of moving to an academic style of writing. It allows me to kind of really gear into my target audience. Anyways, that's all I had.
All right. So we're supposed to finish in 5 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Okay.